Good afternoon and welcome to Double Take, Feast Your Eyes. Please use the Q&A box to ask any questions for our panelists. We'll do a Q&A portion toward the end of today's program. We will also share key information with you throughout the program via the chat box. We ask that you not close your browser window immediately after the program, as a survey will appear for you to provide valuable feedback. This program is being recorded and will be available on our website. It is also being live captioned, which you can access with the CC button at the bottom of your screen. My name is Kelly Skeen, and I am an interpretation specialist at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. This afternoon, we gratefully acknowledge the diverse and vibrant Native communities who have made their home here, the Native peoples on whose ancestral homelands we are gathered, and the labor of people who were enslaved in constructing the historic building that houses the American Art Museum today. It is a pleasure to be with you and present this online version of our popular in-gallery program, Double Take. This series brings together curators from the American Art Museum into conversation with scholars from across the Smithsonian to reveal the unexpected connections between American art and nearly every other subject we cover here at the Smithsonian, from history to anthropology, astronomy to zoology. Today, we'll explore the link between art, food and beer history, and Latinx history and culture. To illuminate this link, I'm joined by two Smithsonian experts. Claudia Zapata, they, them, earned their PhD in art history at Southern Methodist University's RASCA, Rhetorics of Art, Space, and Culture program. They received their BA and MA in art history from the University of Texas at Austin, specializing in Maya art from the Classic period, 250 to 900 CE. Their research interests include curatorial methodologies of identity-based exhibitions, Chicanx and Latinx art, digital humanities, BIPOC zines, and designer toys. Zapata has curated several exhibitions for Texas institutions, including A Viva Voz, Carmen Lomas Garza, 2009, Sam Coronado, a retrospective, 2011, and Fantastic and Grotesque, Jose Clemente Orozco in print, 2014. Currently, Claudia is the curatorial assistant of Latinx art at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. They have published articles in Panhandle Plains Historical Review, Joyas, Journal of Latino/Latin American Studies, El Mundo Zurdo, selected works from the meetings of the Society for the Study of Gloria Anzaldúa, Hemisphere Visual Cultures of the Americas, and Aztlán, a Journal of Chicano Studies. Claudia is joined by their colleague from the National Museum of American History, Steve Velasquez. Stephen Velasquez is a curator for the Division of Culture and Community Life. His research interests include Latinx history, immigration, food and agricultural labor history, and entertainment. He was co-curator for the exhibitions Food, Transforming the American Table, 1950 to 2000, and Many Voices, One Nation. He is currently involved in the exhibition Entertainment Nation, as well as a research project on Mexican vineyard workers in Napa, and a future exhibit on lowrider cars. Past projects include the Bracero Oral History Project and associated traveling exhibit, Bittersweet Harvest, the Bracero Program, 1942 to 1964, Mexican Treasures at the Smithsonian, Azúcar, the Life and Music of Celia Cruz, A Collector's Vision of Puerto Rico, Julia Child's Kitchen at the Smithsonian, as well as many other exhibit cases and special projects. He holds a master's degree in anthropology from the George Washington University and a bachelor's degree from the University of Missouri. Claudia and Steve, thank you very much for joining us today. We are so excited for the conversation. We're going to begin the program by exploring the artwork together. This photograph is by artist Chuck Ramirez and is titled Breakfast Tacos from the series 7 Days. I invite you to spend 30 seconds looking closely and quietly at the image. Let your eyes wander. Direct your gaze to a part of the image you haven't yet seen or focused on. What more can you find? I'm now going to invite Claudia and Steve to join me in making some observations about this artwork. Audience members, feel free to contribute your observations through the Q&A box as well. Claudia and Steve, what do you see? What do you first notice looking at this photograph?
There's definitely more than one person that most likely was at this scene. So there's this element of a gathering based on the number of plates and utensils.
I see coffee and beer cans. I see half-eaten tacos. I see something that makes me hungry right now at lunchtime.
I like what you've noted, Claudia, about something must have happened here before we got on the scene, right? We're noticing that this was likely a gathering of multiple people, certainly a lot going on. One of our participants notes that it seems to be photographed from the perspective of a person who might have just stood up from the meal.
Right, that's definitely a good observation of the aerial component to the work, that in these moments in real life, it's a moment that you wouldn't necessarily think to remember. It's right before you would clean up or throw things away. So that kind of restructuring of what is important is a key element to this composition.
Another participant notes that it looks like sunlight might be hitting the table. That makes me wonder perhaps what time of day it might be. Another attendee notes that they imagine feeling the feel of the different textures, the aluminum foil, the cans, the plastic, the foods, and then imagine how these textures would actually taste. Another person notes appreciating the bouquet, which gives it a sense of circumstance and intentionality. I also noticed that that bouquet, the flowers are a bit wilted. So perhaps that those flowers have been sitting on that table for a couple of days. While the floral centerpiece suggests a more formal setting and that kind of use of real silverware as well, another attendee shares. We have some, oh, go ahead, Claudia.
There's an element of personal preference in terms of eating a breakfast taco. It's usually done in a particular way per the individual. Amount of hot sauce, butter, how much you're adding to something. So it shows the kind of nuance of consumption.
You may not be able to see it very clearly, but in the lower left corner, the unused napkin, in very light blue letters, it says "Joy of Friendship." And that always makes me think when I see a table full of food with many, many different place settings. It is the table is in many respects the heartbeat of a home and family.
I like that our observations here are segueing into us making inferences about what might be going on here. Another participant shares a question. I wonder if they stayed up all night in deep discussion. More inferences about what might have happened before this meal. I wonder too, the presence of beer at a breakfast table is not exceedingly common, at least for all days of the week. So you wonder what might have happened the night before. Another participant notes that the food is gone and that usually pictures are taken before the meal is eaten. More questions about, might it have been a takeout meal with the foil wrap foods? That might suggest that it wasn't home cooked. Another participant noting that was a lively, congenial gathering. And noting too the use of the repetition of the floral, the embroidered plant on the hat, the green plant in the top right, the cilantro leaves on the plate. Also noting again that use of cloth napkins, Steve, that you were talking about might give it a sense of importance or significance. Now that we've explored this artwork a little bit more, I want to just open one last question before we move on briefly. What are you curious about? What more do you want to know in this photograph? And Claudia or Steve, you're welcome to kick off an answer to that question as attendees participate in the chat.
Sure, I want to know a little bit more about who was in attendance and why was this moment chosen as one to memorialize?
That's exactly what I was going to say. I want to know more about what happened here. Was it a celebration of family? Was it friends? Was it after a big announcement? Are they gathered for something that might have been an all-night, family celebration, or even like a barbecue, where they spend all night cooking something. I also want to know, what exactly it is they're eating and where, and where is it from?
A lot of folks in the chat are sharing very similar questions, wondering who was invited and why the table was left in this sort of disarray. Wondering if it was partially staged or if it was a recreated scene. Thinking perhaps this is a gathering of younger people who sometimes come for a party and then don't leave and stay until breakfast. Thinking, I wonder if the folks that were here might have left abruptly. So lots of great curiosity around this piece. And now that we've generated that curiosity and questions about this artwork, I'm going to pass it over to our SAAM expert, Claudia, to tell us a little bit more about breakfast tacos and the artist, Chuck Ramirez.
Great, thank you. If you could go to the first slide, that would be great. Thank you so much. Artist Chuck Ramirez was born in 1962 and died in 2010 as a result of a bicycling accident at the age of 48. While Ramirez's work has been part of international and national artistic dialogues, his relationship to his hometown and final resting place of San Antonio, Texas, truly defines his creative vision. The coy and playful presence of Ramirez in this photo, taken by friend and fellow artist Ethel Shipton, captures his sentiment echoed through the endearing posthumous biographical reflections of the artist by many of his friends as the life of the party, vivacious, loyal, and that he loved to host. As a result of his communal meals and proclivity to spread joy, his friends referred to him as Tia Chuck, which is Spanish for Aunt Chuck. These wry allusions to Ramirez's San Antonio queer camp ethos are a quintessential reading of Ramirez's gregarious nature and characterize the familial hosting and foodways that make up the sumptuous photographs of Ramirez's oeuvre. Next slide, please. Today's featured image of our discussion, Breakfast Tacos, belongs to a 7-part large format photograph series titled 7 Days. Each image of the series reflects a crystallized moment in time, primarily centered on food gatherings, but devoid of any human presence. Ramirez meticulously recreates his still life to realize the aftermath of convivial San Antonio moments. Looking to the historical still life genre of the 17th century Dutch vanitas paintings and their symbolic references to life's impermanence, Ramirez reconstructs his contemporary images to exhibit the aftermath and the forgotten remnants of social memory. His conceptual objectives range from elevating the mundane, critiquing overconsumption, and personifying his local cultural foodways. Next slide, please. Ramirez's tenure as a graphic designer for the Texas supermarket chain H-E-B grocery stores cultivated his skills in creating an alluring inanimate object. His austere minimalist background allows a hyper-focused recognition of commercial packaging design, creating an illusion that may be likened to lavish gilded medieval reliquaries as seen in the Candy Tray series. The subversion of fast food advertising recalls the artist's recurring references to his mortality. In What a Cup, Ramirez centers the oversized cup's recommendation phrasing that reads, quote, "When I am empty, please dispose of me properly," end quote. As an HIV positive gay man, Ramirez would frequently incorporate both his sexual desires as well as his fears and negotiations with his relationship to his health and the prospective aftermath of his possible death in the context of the AIDS crisis. The symbolic parallel of the artist's isolation aesthetics in presenting detritus suggests the artist's own introspection and self-reflection of his personal fragility and disposability. Next slide, please. Food and friends were critical to Ramirez's survival. His community of family and friends references his emotional essence as a central magnetic figure and connector for his artistic communities, seen largely through dinners and parties. While Ramirez identifies as having, quote, grown up white, his Mexican grandmother, Lydia Ramirez, played a pivotal role in teaching him how to cook Mexican dishes and the cultural significance of feeding and nurturing people. Ramirez's residencies above fellow artist Franco Mundini Ruiz's Botanica and the area known as the Compound on the corner acre of Styron and St. Mary Street in San Antonio became legendary spots for his intellectual salons. Fellow San Antonio artist Alejandro Diaz, who was present at many of these historical artistic gatherings, interpreted these public spectacles as an art form unto their own. Next slide. As a fellow San Antonian myself, Ramirez's work successfully articulate the city's visual iconography at the intersection of Southwest, Mexican, Texas, Chicanx, and Latinx cultures. Ramirez's tableaus are fluent in all things San Antonio, whether it be through a Bill Miller sweet tea, big red soda, Whataburger, or a piñata. By subverting the capitalistic objectives that undergird advertising, Ramirez created minimalist, maximalist dedications to the city and people he so generously loved, advocating for a mutual admiration of these communities that nourished him throughout his life. Posthumously, Ramirez's artistic legacy continues and flourishes with recent acquisitions in major museum collections such as SAAM and the Whitney, further solidifying San Antonio as one of the major epicenters of Latinx art in the US. Thank you, and I'll now hand it off to my colleague, Steve Velasquez. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. Thank you, Kelly. As curator at the National Museum of American History, I work on Latino history and food history. Questions I ask tend to be, what are some of the contributions of Latinos to the changing food landscape? How can food collections tell us about Latino and national history? What does the National Museum of American History collect to illustrate Latino contributions to the changing food landscape? And what is the National Museum of American History's approach to collecting and displaying Latino history in a food exhibit? Our collections help illustrate large changes in the American cultural landscape, like the role of immigration on changing communities, growth and access to different foods, the diversity within the Latino community itself, as well as the role of memory, tradition, and politics in food history. The exhibit, Food Transforming the American Table, illustrates some of these distinct strands of community and personal history and how they contribute to the national in food landscape. Next slide, please. I like to think that my work makes visible the role that Latinos have in transforming the American table, shaping what, why, and how we eat. The food exhibit covers nearly 50 years and explores significant changes in what Americans eat and how they eat. Of course, we have things like the Julia Child's Kitchen, which looks at the impact and influence of television personalities in cooking and entertainment. But we also have a large table in the center with revolving content that explores things like school lunches or nutrition pyramids. Next slide, please. Additionally, our exhibit highlights the impact of new technologies in food production, distribution, and consumption, like the rise of mechanization or the changing technologies related to food safety, or the role of the United Farm Workers in agricultural history. Here we have an image of Leonard Nadell with photographing Mexican farm workers or braceros, Mexican guest workers, working in a field in Watsonville, California in 1957. Our exhibit also explores major social and cultural changes in American life that have influenced food and foodways, like the role of immigration in our changing food landscape, but also social movements like the Good Food movement of the 1960s and 70s. Here we have in the upper right an image of a corn grinder that belonged to Concha Sanchez of California, who migrated from Mexico and used this machine to make to grind corn to make tortillas that she would sell on weekends to make extra money in the Ventura, California area. Other examples like this El Chico menu and tortillas in a can label offers a snapshot of the explosion of post-World War II Tex-Mex food restaurant business and the rise of what author Rob Walsh calls, quote, America's oldest regional cuisine, and what Jeffrey Pilcher, historian, describes as novel cooking styles that combine North American ingredients with Mexican sensibilities, and what Gustavo Arellano calls this Texas Mexican Tex-Mex food, quote, as much of an ambassador to the United States as the hot dog. I also explore the role of Mexicans and Latinos in the wine industry, going from vineyard workers to vineyard owners who are now shaping the large wine industry. Next slide, please. My interest also led me to explore the 1975 Royal Chicano Air Force Calendario de Comida, the food calendar. The calendar celebrated the collective Chicano identity through art and food that in part helped engage discussions about history, identity, and equality. The calendar reflected and highlighted indigenous food knowledge, the colonial impact on food and culture, and reimagining of politics and social justice through a shared food culture. Next slide, please. Art and activism often go hand in hand. It's information sharing, it's impactful and often pointed. Here we have a 13-foot paper mache statue of Lady Liberty made by the Coalition of Immokalee Workers and Cat Rodriguez. The Coalition of Immokalee Workers supply about half of the tomato supply here in the United States. And this piece was used in a march from Fort Myers, Florida to Orlando in the March for Dignity and Justice. The coalition often uses art in marches and protests to grab attention, but to help others understand their struggles. Next slide, please. The 1960s, paradigm shift as citizens, residents, and communities demanded equality and justice. Community activists like Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta and the United Farm Workers insisted that everyone should have a voice and that we should all fight for justice, equality, and rights. Art has always been an important part of this union to tell their story, encourage protests, and to create identity. Young Chicano artists emerge as leaders in the visual identity of this Chicano movement, creating some of the more iconic images to capture the cause and to stir passion and action. These artists often emerge from the cause as leaders in the arts community. So the work in food and Latino history that I do often impacts how I think about this whimsical photo called Breakfast Tacos. I see many entry points to explore other aspects of cultural and social history and different experiences. Where you might see a foil wrapper, I look at and ask questions about food consumption. What or how are we eating this? About production and distribution. Where and how did the food get to the table? Where you see a taco, I see culture and tradition. Where you see a can of Lone Star Miller beer, I think about German immigration and the business and economics of the beer industry. Food plays different roles and carries a variety of meanings. Food is nourishment. Food is identity. Food is memory. Food is politics. And I like to think that Ramirez is actually thinking about all these deeper subjects here in this work. Thank you.
Great. So now Steve and I will discuss amongst ourselves a little bit more about the image and some additional works from SAAM's collection. So for this one is really interesting for Breakfast Tacos because I was able to speak to Chuck's sister, Patricia, and ask a little bit more about this moment. And she was kind enough to share that this scene is basically a recreation of a Sunday breakfast, a brunch at their father's home, where they had barbacoa tacos. So again, like I was speaking about San Antonio and how this is very San Antonio specific, and some of the questions in the Q&A were talking about, why is there reference to Mexico, and then also why is there butter? And I think all of those very much speak to this being Texas and San Antonio, that those kind of moments of the table are very authentic because Chuck literally took everything from his father's space and recreated it. So this is what it looked like. But butter, for example, is pretty common addition that people add to their tacos. I personally don't. That's not a personal preference of mine, but it's really common in Texas. And then the Mexico, I think that's such a smart inclusion because Chuck is always dealing with being from this bicultural standpoint of being perceived as white, but also having a Mexican side to him, but also living in San Antonio. To be that in San Antonio, there's no way of getting around experiencing this scene. If you live in San Antonio, you will have experienced this scene, maybe not with the specific ingredients, but you would have experienced this moment and know the particularities of the textures, of the sights and sounds and the smells of breakfast tacos specifically.
When I first saw this image, I was immediately thinking about the role of family and the role of culture in our society and individually. And so, I immediately caught the Mexico, the taco reference, and immediately thought about how, again, the kitchen food is often the centerpiece for family and friends, the center, the heartbeat of culture in some respects. And so I'm was thinking about what some San Antonio restaurateur, I think from Mi Tierra, often calls familia, comida, y cultura, the three kind of sisters, if you will, of culture, of identity. And so that immediately came to my mind when I saw this. I immediately thought of, this is like a fast food breakfast, right? But not a fast food that other people wouldn't normally have. I mean, these are things you would find almost everywhere in San Antonio, kind of. And so I often was thinking about, well, who made this? I mean, was it from a restaurant? It looks like it was from a restaurant, but it could have easily been made by, somebody's mom or grandmother, abuelita. And so I started immediately thinking about those moments where we come together as family and friends, as groups, and kind of share culture, share stories, share laughs, share those moments, good or bad, and often think about what were they doing before this. So yeah.
Right. Yeah, I was interested in the restaurant because usually in San Antonio you have a preference of taco places because there's so many, but usually you have your go-to. And I asked Chuck's sister, she didn't know necessarily. She suggested it was a restaurant called Tito's, but she couldn't remember what his favorite place was. But she did mention that Lone Star beer. So you're seeing Lone Star beer and Miller Lite, which may disrupt you that it's breakfast, but it's very common that people drink at breakfast because it's beer. That the Lone Star beer was the label and flavor of choice for Chuck's father, and Miller Lite was stepmother's preference. So here we have the references to the people without actually seeing a human hand or seeing a body. So the brands act as a stand-in for the people. I thought that was particularly poignant, basically way of doing a family portrait without actually showing anybody, mainly their essence or their food style.
That's great too. I didn't know that. I mean, you mentioned individuality, and I noticed, two people are eating their breakfast tacos with forks, or maybe they're just picking up the remnants, and then one person that looks almost clearly like a big bite was taken out of the thing. Fork is not used. And at first I thought it was connected to the Miller Lite beer. And so I was wondering exactly who ate that, um, and why they didn't use the fork. But certainly that individuality comes out. You could see some people have the salsa and it looks like beans. Clearly some people did not. And so it's good to know who was kind of referenced in this and why. And I think, again, that family connection and a kitchen table, I think so much happens in a kitchen table. And there's a great scholar who looks at women's history, family history, and she did this by recording a lot of stories by sitting at the kitchen table and getting to issues, economic issues, gender issues, social issues by sitting around the table and just sharing these stories. And I think that's the power that kind of food has for us, is to remember these moments, to use it as entry points into other kinds of issues that are happening around the United States, around the world. So yeah.
Definitely, we should go to the next slide because that continues this theme that we're touching on of the kitchen and the domestic spaces. So these are two works that are in SAAM's collection, and they highlight the central role of the kitchen. So this is very common theme that's touched on by Chicanx and Latinx artists. And for example, Carmen Lomas Garza, who's internationally renowned artist and has a series of children's books, and as her images end up in Spanish language textbooks and airports. She's just everywhere. But this is probably one of her most famous images, the tamalada. So if you're from Texas or Mexico or the Southwest, you probably are familiar with this scene. But if you're not, so this is when you are making tamales. So usually this is during Christmas, and it's a very labor intensive experience. Sometimes it's multiple days, and you are making basically a cornmeal type of material that has a filling that maybe beans or meat or things like that, but it involves using corn husks and steaming the insides in this like large pan and pot. There's so many elements to it, and it's usually associated with not efficiency. It's actually more about inefficiency. It's more about getting together and connecting with the people who you're making the tamales with, usually your family and friends. But there's so many elements that, Steve, that you touch upon in your discussion about tools and utensils and things like that that are in this scene. I don't know if you can see the molcajete, for example, that's on the right next to the oven. And I think that's really interesting connection to the ancient world, because so tamales have been prevalent throughout Mesoamerica. You see them in the ancient codices, you see them in glyphs, you see them in the colonial era. And so it's this type of food that has this huge legacy, ranging from creation myths by the Maya in regards to humans being made by the gods using masa material or this cornmeal type of material. So it's very weighted in its significance throughout the Americas and in the Southwest and amongst Chicanx and Latinx cultures. It's something that's very common. It's a very common scene, and it's central to a lot of artists' reflection on their own histories. And for Carmen specifically, she's a Texan. She's originally from Kingsville, but she's now in San Francisco. But most of her popular images are about these memories of her family. And that's why so many people kind of connect to this work, is because it helps explain certain Mexican traditions. And it's in this very accessible way of understanding what exactly is going on. And there's this sort of joyfulness that she's able to represent in all of her works.
Yeah, I love this image of the tamalada. I immediately think about the multi-generational aspect of food of this image particularly. And you're right, it is inefficient in a way, and it is more so about the family gathering and tradition than it is making something. Concha Sanchez and her family, when she would sell the tamales, the tortillas, she would often start this process on Friday, because in order to make masa or the dough, you would soak corn in lime and boil it, and then dry it and rinse it and then grind it. And the boiling and soaking is usually an overnight process. And so she would gather with her grandchildren and her children and start this process on Friday, and then they would make the tortillas first thing Saturday morning to take to the market. And it was, yes, it was kind of an economic thing, but it was also a family thing. And so that reminds me, with this image here of the grandparents, the grandfather clearly helping with the husks, and then grandmother arranging them in a container. They're in the forefront. They're the beginnings of the family history, so to speak. But then I love the little kind of Easter eggs in the background, the calendar, the Last Supper image, or the other cocina image on the right with the Aztec warrior calendar above the oven, which, uh, these kinds of images, Claudia can explain a little bit better. These calendar images were often found in bakeries, restaurants, often giveaways, often sold for very small amounts. That would often have these images that get picked up and kind of incorporated into Chicano art. Um, Later in the 60s and 70s, and kind of very important, I think, in creating this identity, because it was often present in the backgrounds of these homes, of these places, and kind of leave these impressions.
Yeah, definitely the calendars. I'm glad that you mentioned that, because you featured the Royal Chicano calendario, and that was such a significant part of the Chicano print movement, is that the calendar art form was reused and rethought of as this accessible way of promoting fine art and making it available to the community. And the Jesus Elguera image, the Jesus Elguera is the Mexican artist who creates these very elaborate and seductive images of Mexican myths. So the image that you're seeing is the Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl is this kind of Romeo and Juliet story of Mexico, referencing the two volcanoes. And it's just one of those images that artist Jesus Elguera, his images ended up on so many commercial products, including the calendars. And it's this great touchstone to Mexico. And because Larry's from Arizona, and so there's this connectivity to Mexico. For Carmen Lomas Garza, she puts flamenco dancers, which may be any part of the Americas or Spain, but there's a reference to Christianity, most likely Catholicism, especially with the reference to the Virgen de Guadalupe, and these kind of nice little nuances and touches of the roses, and talking about these myths. For the Virgen de Guadalupe, it's so integral for her story that the roses are there because it's part of these items that the indigenous person who encountered the Virgen, Juan Diego, used to legitimize her apparition in 1531, when people didn't believe him. And so I think Larry does a really good job of kind of linking you to all these stories. Carmen, very similarly, linking you to as this family you don't know, but linking you to this story of Mexican culture and you wanting to be there. It's a very, all of these spaces, especially with Chuck and Carmen and Larry, they are very welcoming. They're not scary or they're not ominous. These are clearly spaces that are safe spaces, and that the artist memorializes in a way in a positive way, that they want to reflect on this in perpetuity.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned spaces, because I think it's the next slide. Can we maybe? Oh, that's. I'm thinking that the other thing about spaces is you said this is a safe space, but for many Mexican American families, for many Latinos in the United States, a lot of labor is in agriculture, and that's often not a very kind of safe space. It's a different kind of space, and we can get to that later.
Yeah, there's if we're 2 slides over, we can show some of those. That one.
Yeah. And so field work is often not a safe space, and I think these images here are reflecting that kind of that struggle to make the space of work, make the space of farming safer for everybody. And some of these artists did it in their own ways. Um, but I am drawn to these kinds of images and the messages that these are for. And for those of you who don't know, the United Farm Workers, they were fighting for equality and justice. They were fighting for things like water breaks, water in the field, healthcare benefits, death benefits, things that we often take for granted. But in the 1960s, 1970s, that wasn't available to these folks. And they wanted to, and the right to unionize, the right to have a voice. So there were these struggles, and um, there were issues with pesticides, there were issues with wages, and the United Farm Workers, started by Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, was really kind of the you might say the centerpiece of the Chicano movement at the time, kind of the wide, the front-facing part of the movement. The Chicano movement itself was based on many different things about equality, about access, about voice. And with the farm workers movement, they were able to shift this discussion from outside of the fields to consumers and grocery stores and restaurants, and it became very visible. And that's why it was kind of the face of the movement. But you see that with the boycott grapes, there was this huge movement to make their issues known, and again, take it out of the field, right? You could strike at your workplace, you could strike at the field, but the field workers at the field owners at the time would just do a workaround and get other contract laborers in. But they figured out a way to go straight to the consumer, straight to the grocery store, to make a bigger impact, where the farmers had to really do something. And I love the stories of the boycotts where even they got dock workers involved. There was this huge community built with the civil rights movement, SNCC, and all these other labor organizing institutions and networks that they tapped into. And some of the stories where they were able to get dock workers in New York to leave the crates of grapes on the docks or on the ships without moving it. And so at some point, the farmers really had to do something. And so that was very pointed, and I thought an excellent strategy for them.
Yes, definitely. These works were featured in a recent show called Printing the Revolution. It's now it's a traveling exhibition. Lechuga is not in it, but the other two are prominent in the exhibition. So at SAAM, we featured these works, and yes, it's the artwork and the artists are very pivotal to all of this political movements and generating funds and being part of the UFW in a specific way that connects artists as social activists. And that continues today. That was definitely the argument of the exhibition, is that this is part of a legacy of a graphics movement that is very much politically inclined. And that unfortunately, several of these images have been revisited, and labor inequities and general oppression is still a major theme for Chicanx graphic artists. And labor and pesticides and environmental activism is still at the forefront, considering it was pivotal to the UFW's movement against anti-pesticides in the 60s. It's still very much a problem today. And several of the artists know firsthand about these experiences, that they were part of the picking. They were part of these labor camps, or they moved with their families. So it's not from afar that they're referencing. I think the earlier works that we showed, that's a different part of the foodways and the food process. And these in particular that we're looking at right now, these are very much on the fields, the hands of the artists and the effects of their family with what's going on. So if you want to learn more, I definitely look at that exhibition catalog. And it's definitely a focus for the Chicano movement, is beginning with the UFW, Dolores Huerta, and Cesar Chavez. This is often the central focus because it had such wide range internationally and nationally in terms of creating a lot of the iconography that you see. For example, the UFW logo in the lower right-hand corners of that boycott grapes, this red flag with what's seen as a thunderbird or an upturned pyramid. These logos become the common iconography in Chicano art that continue today. So this whole protest imagery lexicon begins in this moment. So these are central to the history of art as we know it.
Claudia and Steve, thank you so much, Claudia. Thank you for making that connection back to kind of the broader Chicano movement and the art associated with it. Before we close, I wanted to elevate a couple of questions from the audience. There's so much to be gained from being in the virtual environment. We're able to have participants from all over the country and the world, but one thing that we lose is the ability to see this artwork installed in the gallery. So I'm wondering, Claudia and Steve, if you can talk to us a little bit about the scale of the work, how it might feel to be in front of it, looking at it in the gallery context.
It's very large. It's very, it's looming. It's cinematic, is how I describe it.
So it's about 4 by 5 feet, right, Claudia?
Yeah, I mean, these are part of his practice. Some of his work is smaller, but it tends to be larger. So you really get this focus on the details of the scenes. So the kind of the exercise that we did at the beginning is perfect, because that's really what Ramirez is facilitating with this sort of choice in scale. He wants you to look at everything and to really get this kind of operatic spectacle of the normal by using this type of approach.
Great. And we have a couple of questions about some of those details in the work. One participant is curious if you know anything about the pattern on the flatware.
No, I don't know anything about a very specific question, very appropriate. No, I'm not familiar with that. I don't think there's a specific designer or if there's a legacy to heirlooms with the family, I'm unsure.
Yeah, that's something I did not think to look at, but I can certainly dive into our collection of domestic utensils that we have. We have quite a large collection, but to me, on first glance, it does seem that it's quite a common set, probably something that is inexpensive that could probably be bought anywhere in one of these department stores or chain stores somewhere. But I didn't think about looking at that.
Well, it's great when we get to look at an image together and new things and questions come up. Another audience member is noticing the cover over the tablecloth and wondering if that's perhaps decorative or for protection of the tablecloth.
It's probably a protective cover. There's another artist from San Antonio named Rolando Briseno, who's Steve, you mentioned to me an email, and who I've met a couple of times, but he is he likes to look at tablecloth covers and table mats and everything like that. So this table set and the kind of accoutrement of a Mexican American kitchen dining experience is something that comes up in Latinx art. And so it's not unsurprising that these kind of details of the kitchen top and the countertop are part of this. But most likely, in terms of function, is probably to prevent staining or moving, because the top is probably slippery, unless this is fabric. Again, this would be a very specific Chuck family question, if that's a fabric tablecloth or if it's one that is a little bit more plastic-like, because those tend to be slippery, but it's easier to clean. And you'll see those often in Mexican restaurants or homes, just dependent on the preference.
Yeah, that Marimekko kind of plastic tablecloth is pretty common. I guess that's one thing about the virtual world is you can't really see it here. You'll be able to see it up close and personal when it is up. But I can't really tell from my screen what it is, but it does look like a table, a place setting, kind of a loosely woven, maybe a gay, maybe, something like that. Kind of, again, maybe an inexpensive thing, because you notice they are eating off of paper plates too. So.
Well, thanks for your insight and digging deeper into that. I'm noticing that we're kind of approaching the end of our program here. Claudia and Steve, I want to give you a moment to share kind of any final words before we wrap up.
Sure, I just wanted to thank everybody in attendance, and if you're interested in learning more about Chuck Ramirez, you can check out SAAM's website that features this image in our online database, and also Patricia Ruiz-Healy, who is the executive of the Ramirez Estates, and the Ruiz-Healy Gallery that's in San Antonio represents Chuck. And there are several other images that you can see, and you can inquire if you're interested in purchasing any of the remaining works as well.
I want to thank you, Kelly, and the whole team at SAAM, and you, Claudia, for inviting me. This was a fun kind of exercise and event to kind of dig deep into this. I mean, I think we could probably talk forever, keep going about the foods used in pre-Columbian times and how that kind of gets represented today, or even beer history and German immigration. I mean, there's all kinds of things we could continue to talk about. But if you want to get a little taste of it, I encourage you to also visit the food exhibit at American History, which delves deeper into some of these aspects. So thank you.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you all so much for joining us, and thank you to Claudia and Steve. It's so meaningful to explore American art through different lenses and disciplines. In particular, how this photograph, a representation of daily life, contains just so much deep history and symbols within it. I also want to thank the behind the scenes team for all their work to help the program run smoothly. And once again, please fill out the survey in your browser and let us know what you enjoyed about today's program. Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.